All right, everybody, come on in. It's Friday. It's the Democracy Stupid. I'm Edwin Eisendrath, and I'm joined today by Ben Berwick, who leads Protect Democracy's election law and litigation team, which means he's responsible for that organization's work to keep our democracy afloat a little bit longer. He's also a lecturer at Harvard Law. They run a clinic there teaching about the rule of law and democracy. And he served all of us, by being part of the Department of Justice for 6+ years when that department actually worked for Americans. Ben, thank you for joining me today.
It's really my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
So first, let's just start with this because not everybody's familiar with Protect Democracy, and tell us a little about the organization.
Yeah, so Protect Democracy is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. It was founded in 2017 to prevent a decline towards a more authoritarian form of government in the United States. We are truly a nonpartisan organization, so we have individuals working for us who are lifelong Republicans and have spent time in Republican politics, but who are opposed to sort of Trump's authoritarian project. And we have many people who work for the organization who are lifelong Democrats and have worked in Democratic politics and government, including myself. But the connective tissue is that we all believe in sort of the American democratic project and are all extremely concerned about the direction in which Trump is taking this country. Particularly certainly from a policy perspective to some extent, but taking us down a path towards authoritarianism.
Okay. I want to come back to that nonprofit thing later, not right now, but let's talk about that path he's taking us down. You've described it as disrupt, deny, or deceive, disrupt, and deny.
Yeah.
I got a whole list of things he's done, but talk about what you see happening that truly is exploiting the position that he has to end our democracy.
Yeah. So let me step back for a minute and sort of ask the question, like, what is Trump doing? Why is he doing all of the things he is doing? And I think the answer is actually pretty simple. He's historically unpopular, right? His approval rating is at something like 34%. He's underwater on pretty much every major domestic policy issue, foreign policy issue, the economy, immigration, the war in Iran, et cetera. And so he knows that if the 2026 midterms are free and fair, his party is going to get crushed. And so he's not really trying to win the argument anymore. He's not really fighting to be popular politically. He's trying to rig the game, and he's using the full power of the federal government to do it so that he can hold on to power without actually winning it from the voters. And so, as you mentioned, we recently released this report called Executive Override, in which we sort of try to explain the strategy in a way that is more digestible, because it can be overwhelming to kind of to digest everything that's happening every day. So we, as you said, we think you can really break the strategy down into 3 parts, which we call the 3 Ds: deceive, disrupt, and deny. So very, very briefly, and I'm happy to talk about any of these in more detail, but deceive is favor in the favor of his allies, and then deny, if his favored candidates still lose, contest or try to overturn the results. And I think a lot of the actions we're seeing in the world right now can be explained using that framework. Basically, it's all an attempt to try to position himself to tilt the electoral playing field and enable interference in the election if that becomes necessary.
Well, they've demonstrated in the past. They've certainly done this before.
Absolutely. But what I will say is the difference now is that Trump and sort of his election denier allies hold a lot of the levers of power, right? So it differs from what we saw in 2020 and 2022 and 2024 in that, I think, important respect, which is throughout the government, Trump has installed loyalists and those who have subscribe to election denial lies in the past.
Okay, and some of the ways you cheat an elect, you disrupt elections. I don't know which category this is, but in the old school, there's sort of voter suppression. You stop people from voting. You can also change the map so their votes don't matter.
Yep.
We'll talk about that too. And you can then do all kinds of things after the votes are cast to make sure they're counted in an interesting way, or not counted at all. So we have the Supreme Court joining them in some incredibly strange decisions in the last couple of years to get rid of the Voting Rights Act and allow gerrymandering to happen left and right in America. No, just right in America, and racist gerrymandering too.
Yeah.
Have you been involved in that litigation?
So we haven't been directly involved in that litigation, but certainly tracking it closely. And I will say, I think, part of the sort of disrupt part of the strategy is just seeking to change the rules to make it harder for eligible people to vote or have their votes counted. And Calais, that's the Supreme Court decision that gutted Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act a couple of weeks ago. That is certainly sort of the headline development here right now. That it makes Section 2 basically all but a dead letter, as Justice Kagan said. And it has touched off this really unprecedented cycle, like rush to engage in mid-cycle gerrymandering in mostly in southern states, in a way that it's just like the extent to which it is a naked attempt to take political power away from particularly minority voters is just shocking. And on top of that, it is, I think, part of the intent here is to create some uncertainty and confusion and chaos, and it's certainly having that effect. I mean, we're talking about redistricting in states where elections have already started. So you're going to have voters and election officials and others just extremely confused about what's going on. Voters may not know where to go to vote.
Let me get you pause here there 1 second, get your thoughts on this. Because John Roberts opines that people like me, mere mortals who aren't, steeped in constitutional law, really don't understand the complexities of the decisions he's making. But I am pretty savvy about politics, and I know something about timing.
Yeah.
Right? The timings of these decisions has for decades simply favored one party over the other, and particularly on the standards they use about when you're close to election, can you meddle or not? They have applied those entirely in a partisan fashion, and that is so clear in this cycle that I don't know how John Roberts can pretend that he is above politics and use the timing tools of a politician to such effect. This has nothing to do with the law.
Yeah, I'm not going to pretend to know what's in John Roberts' mind, but certainly the effect that you're talking about is real. You're referring to a thing called the Purcell Principle.
I am.
Which the Supreme Court has said, courts basically should not change the rules of elections close enough in time to when we're really close in time to elections, because that's disruptive.
And then they just did.
And voters. But that Purcell Principle seems to only apply when the court is being asked to make changes that are pro-voter, right? When the court is being asked to make changes that are anti-voter or is likely to suppress vote or make it harder for people to vote, it seems like the Purcell Principle goes out the window. Yeah. So in that sense, I do think these decisions seem kind of lawless to me. In particular, in the case of the aftermath of Calais, like the court did this pretty amazing thing where it accelerated its own normal process to allow Alabama to redistrict when sort of right before the primary election was going to start. And it's hard to see how that's consistent with the Purcell Principle.
Well, so to go back to your mission here, which is to protect our democracy and the rule of law, you just called the Supreme Court lawless. and I want to say I agree with you, by the way, or I think their legitimacy is in question, but that's a really dangerous place for the country, because the most important job of a Supreme Court in a society like ours is to make sure we all know what the law is. one of the many unfortunate legacies of this court is that we no longer know what the law is. So you take the shadow docket decisions and the precedents, they all run in different directions. And if you're a federal judge, you're going like, what's the guidance, guys?
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know what the law is anymore. And they had a decision on tariffs, which should have been pretty easy, right? Okay, Congress has that power, but it was a complicated set of opinions all about major questions.
Yeah.
Like they have made it so that we don't know what the law is. And I think that is a fundamentally dangerous thing because that's their one job.
Yeah, and ultimately, courts don't have armies; they don't have guns, right? I mean, they have marshal service, but for the most part, their legitimacy and their power comes from their consistent application of the law, from their ability to explain what they are doing, from their persuasiveness. And so I share the feeling you do that it's sometimes hard to understand what the Supreme Court in particular is doing, why it's reaching certain decisions. And because they aren't explaining their decisions, it's easy to ascribe sort of partisan or other bad motives for. I think that's in a lot of cases that is actually what is going on. I will say, I think it's important to say, we're talking about the Supreme Court. I think district courts in particular
have done a very good job.
Lower level judges have done a very good job and are doing their best in the face of very unclear guidance from the Supreme Court. And frankly, in the face of an administration that doesn't treat them with any respect, that has shown time and again they're willing to lie to district court judges.
Got called out here in Chicago for that just last week.
Exactly. Yeah. That's right. And nonetheless, I think many district court judges are continuing to do their job. It's one of the few institutions that I think have really held in the face of this administration.
Okay, so that's sort of the gerrymandering piece of this, and it is, we'll leave the race politics out for a moment, but it is appalling. They also, in some cases, have been allowed to relocate polling places without telling people.
Right.
Huge problem in the Texas primary in Dallas, but it's apparently legal to do. Well, stunning. Now there are election deniers who've been raised to positions of power over the elections themselves. Terrifying. What do you make of the effort of the Trump administration to collect voter data and to build a federal voting database that's somehow the master list for all of us?
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of a part of this pattern of the administration trying to take control of elections. I mean, under our American system, the federal government actually has a very small and almost no role in administering elections, right? It's a very diffuse
time, place, manner,
where each of the states and localities run elections, and Congress can pass laws that govern how that happens, but the president doesn't really have any role in administering elections. But as part of this sort of deceive, disrupt, deny effort, the administration has sort of attempted to say, well, we're going to take control. We have the power to do it. And they've done a number of things, including asking states to provide voter rolls. And if they refuse, suing them to try and get them, I will say unsuccessfully. Another example where district courts are standing up to the administration. Basically, to kind of partly to spread the narrative that I will say an extremely false narrative that there's this epidemic of voting in our elections by non-citizens who are ineligible to vote. In fact, that's not true, and it's disproven time and time again. But also, I think the thing to be sort of more concerned about as we look down the road is that the federal government is going to compile this information in some way and create sort of their own lists of eligible voters that are undoubtedly going to be inaccurate and exclude a lot of eligible voters, a lot of Americans who have the right to vote, and that some states will use those lists in some way to decide who can vote and who can't, which will have the result, again, of disenfranchising a number of eligible voters. I will say
it'll also have the other impact of employing lawyers for another generation.
Yes, of course,
Yeah.
always. You're right. I expect there will be a lot of litigation about this. As I alluded to before, I think the administration's efforts to make this happen, to force states to comply, has just been completely unsuccessful in district court. That being said, some states have voluntarily complied, and I think there's reason to be concerned about how the government is going to use the data that they have compiled from states that have complied.
I guess it's also related to the safety of our elections, the absolutely purging of dissent from the Republican Party, the turning of the Republican Party into a sort of MAGA hardcore as opposed to a big tent. America isn't used to that, and it it's a different kind of politics that we're not used to. It's not a multi-party democracy, so they're treated as a co-equal party, even though they are a very limited force these days. And this slush fund, which I think will never see the light of day, but to support vigilantes around the country, is enormously dangerous.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mentioned that a sort of major difference between now and previous elections is that Trump loyalists are in power in the federal government, but also we see all these ways that Trump is sort of building this institutional and financial infrastructure to ensure that he can reward those who are on his side and loyalists and punish those who are against him. And I think the slush fund that you referred to, which by the way was at least temporarily enjoined by a court this morning, is a primary example of that, right? Like this, it's almost $1.8 billion controlled that came out of a lawsuit from Trump against the IRS that he controls. So it's this completely collusive settlement of a lawsuit. It's just fraud, basically. And the way this money is going to be distributed is, going to be totally opaque and is going to be decided by people he appointed and can fire. And I think it's reasonable to assume that this slush fund is going to be used to kind of pay off his allies and reward those who.
That's what he said. I mean,
and
it's so interesting. You called it fraud, and just for people to understand this, it's fraud against the court itself. Really, they used the system they used our judicial system to make a payoff.
That's right.
And it isn't, by the way, the first time this administration has done it. It did it.
Like Michael Flynn, has received money through this sort of fraud.
It's fraud, but I think it's fraud against the court, and I think the courts themselves don't know how to defend themselves.
I think that's right. It's also fraud against the American people here. I think one of the reasons you're seeing the pushback from, the kind of unusual reaction from Republican members of Congress, and why this is so politically unpopular. A lot of the corruption that we see from the Trump administration, I think people realize it's corruption, but it's maybe not corruption that feels that close to home, or the payoff from foreign governments, the cryptocurrency stuff, right? I think people recognize that as gross and corrupt, but this slush fund is so obviously a transfer of money from American taxpayers. I don't care what political party you are. It's taking your money to pay off Trump's cronies and people who've committed crimes and been justly prosecuted, and others, and probably Trump and his family, and that kind of obvious transfer of wealth from the American people to Trump and his allies. I think is just unpalatable to most.
Good, it should be unpalatable.
Yeah, absolutely.
As a reminder, the other ways that they are paying off their supporters and robbing us taxpayers are through no bid contracts. Like what we see, he met a guy at New Jersey in Bedford and said, "Hey, will you paint the reflecting pool in Washington?" And it's way over budget. It's not doing the job. They're paying way too much for it. But it's we have these systems in our government in order to have integrity in contracting, in order to protect taxpayers and get the job done. And when you ignore them corruptly. I mean, I know that from city government in Chicago. It's just a thing. And the federal government used to be better than that. And you also get it through regulatory people are giving Trump money for regulatory decisions, and that's also. I mean, there was a time when the Justice Department would arrest people for this stuff.
Yeah, and I will say the flip side of what you're talking about is, of course, we see the Justice Department place there where I worked for 7 years, and one of the, at the time I was there, I thought one of the great institutions in sort of American government, an institution that was truly dedicated to justice, which is kind of amazing, just being now totally weaponized as a tool of retaliation against sort of the administration and Trump's perceived enemies and opponents. We see these retaliatory investigations against folks like Jim Comey and others. In Chicago, this is close to home, right? The prosecution of the Broadview Six, the protesters who were the target of this really frivolous prosecution. This is a pattern.
Judicial misconduct, which
prosecutorial misconduct,
and brave judiciary, prosecutorial misconduct.
So this targeting of opponents and prosecutors is really dangerous and really contrary to the First Amendment, and a thing we've seen over and over again.
This is the stuff you see in Moscow. The weaponization of government this way, and I mean. This is painful even to ask, and I mean more painful to be asked, I'm afraid. But what does it feel like having spent so much time in the Justice Department, in that great part of our government, and to see it switch sides?
Yeah, it is heartbreaking because I do think it was such sort of a shining example of the good side of American government. I'm not saying the Justice Department has not been perfect historically.
Nobody's perfect.
Nobody's perfect. But I think it was mostly a force for good. And, I was always extremely proud to sort of stand up in front of a court and say, Ben Berwick for the United States of America. That was a real honor to be able to do that and to do what I thought was right. And I can honestly say during my time at the Justice Department, I never felt pressure from political appointees to take a position I wasn't comfortable with or to do something that I thought was wrong. And it's really sad to see this institution just really gutted. For a long time, my view was I left the Justice Department pretty much as soon as Trump came into office because I decided I sort of couldn't be part of that administration. But I respected my colleagues who made a different decision. I thought it was important for good people to stay and continue to try and do good at the Justice Department. I don't believe that anymore. I think the institution is now so kind of rotten to its core that you sort of can't be there's no way to stay there. Staying there means you are just, even if you don't want to, you're kind of supporting this now completely corrupted institution.
Yeah.
It's sad. It's really sad.
Yeah. Oh, so we've talked about the erosion of the rule of law and the ways they can cheat in elections. And that terrifies people. But I see around the country a lot of things that make me optimistic. So talk about how we're fighting back.
I'm so glad you're asking that. So I do feel like my tone in the first 20 minutes or so of this interview have been pretty dark, and I actually don't feel that way. I also feel optimistic. I think the threat is real, but I do think we can win, right? And I think that for a number of reasons. I think Trump has made a mistake that I think other autocrats that we've seen around the world have not made. When you look at Orban in Hungary, Erdogan, others around the world, they sort of slowly consolidated power.
Even Putin went slowly.
Even Putin went kind of slow, exactly. And Trump moved too fast. So he is now his base of support has collapsed before he's been able to really fully consolidate power, which is a hard thing to do in the United States in a system where our elections really aren't controlled by the federal government and are so use. As I said, courts are holding the line. I think district courts in particular have been a really important check on this administration. And I think the public sees it, right? I think significant majorities of the American people kind of intuitively understand this deceive, disrupt, deny strategy. They've seen it before. Polls find that roughly twice as many Americans don't believe election lies as those that believe them. And maybe most importantly, I think we're seeing civil society mobilized in a way that we maybe haven't in a long time. I mean, this goes back to the No Kings marches, but also the recent protests and in Alabama after the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. I think people are really mobilized and ready to get out and vote and protect the democracy. So I am optimistic. I get asked a lot, sort of, what can I do? What can we do? I think the main thing is, like, and I heard a sort of a civil rights organizer say this, pick a lane and go, right? No one has to do everything. You don't even have to do a big thing, but everyone has to do something. Being engaged is sort of the most important thing here. So that can be countering disinformation with those in your lives. That can be things like volunteering as a poll worker. It can be supporting local and state election officials. It can be joining your local indivisible chapter and being prepared to mobilize peacefully. It can mean strengthening community connections. Like, I think we should be really inspired by what happened in Minnesota around the protests and ICE deployment there, where that community really stepped up and bonded together. And ordinary people were out in the streets taking some risks to film ICE, to protect their neighbors, to help people who are afraid to leave their homes, leave their homes. And the more we can do that kind of thing, I think the better chance we have of ensuring that this administration really cannot interfere with our elections. It's really up to us.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, I'm old, so I get to say for the rest of my life, and probably mean it, going to be angry at corporate leadership in America for failing us in this moment. I'm going to be angry at some big law firms for deciding the rule of law didn't matter in this moment. I'm going to be angry at some fabulous universities who did not believe that they could take the pain that was required to believe in the pursuit of truth. But I am in awe of the American people.
Yeah.
Because even though everyone who had a lot to lose walked away, but they had a lot to lose, but they would have still kept a lot. Those of us who have only something to lose and very little to gain are out there saving the country. And thank God for it everywhere.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think one of the stories of this last couple of years is the failure of big institutions like corporations, like universities, like law firms. Not all of them.
Your Harvard is bravely carrying on, and I'm a university, and I'm very proud of it.
And some of the law firms who were targeted stood up and said no and sued and have won, and they should get credit for that. But I think to a large degree, we've seen a sort of institutional cowardice and failure to resist this administration. And we've, as you say, we've seen the American people
and the media too.
Yeah. And yeah, I think the media is more of a mixed bag. Certainly, we see efforts by the Trump administration to take over media entities and install people who are favorable to them. We see a lot of pressure from the FCC and Brendan Carr to target those who are critical of the president, like Jimmy Kimmel, like Stephen Colbert, like others, in ways that are just blatant violations of free speech. But I do think there are still quite a few members of the media who are out there and are not cowed by those threats.
Well, and then there's the invention of platforms like this. And I think people want to find the truth, have the ability to find it. Now, there's a lot of disinformation and junk out there, but people can find the truth, which you can't do in Russia. So we're still ahead of the game. Well, I wanted to get your thoughts on some of the ideas that are floating around to deal with gerrymandering. Map making does not go away ever, as long as you have districts. I suppose we could pick the House of Representatives by lottery, right? Just, not have elections, just like have a national lottery. But if you don't do that, you're going to have districts. So people are going to make maps. But the solutions that people are talking about are to make the maps themselves, not by drawing their boundaries, but by changing the rules to make them less determinative of the outcome. Multi-member districts, proportional representation, things like that. Are you guys involved in those kinds of debates?
Yeah, we have a team here, some real experts on proportional representation, thing, we've been thinking about it for a long time as a potential solution, or at least mitigator for a lot of the things that are going wrong in American democracy. So I think you're right. I do think sort of gerrymandering is a symptom of a broader problem, and that broader problem is our sort of single member winner take all districts. So where every district has one winner, that means if Democrats have 51% of the vote and Republicans have 49% of the vote, Democrats get all the representation and Republicans get none, which sort of makes no sense. And so I do think proportional representation, while not necessarily a total silver bullet, is a really important step to fixing kind of quite a gerrymandering and some other problems like extreme political polarization we have in this country. For those who don't know, proportional representation is basically a system where you would have multi-member districts. So instead of, so take my state, Massachusetts, we have 9 districts. God, I hope that's right. I think it's 9. Let's say it's 9 for purposes of this. Instead of, so maybe you combine it and you make Massachusetts 2 districts, one that has 5 members and one that has 4. And in the district with 4, if you're 50% Republican, 50% Democrat, you get 2 Democratic members, 2 Republican members. In district with 5, let's say it's 60% Democrat, 40% Republican. Democrats would get 3 members, Republicans would get 2. So instead of a 9-0 delegation, you'd have a 5-4 delegation, which much more closely matches the actual distribution of ideology in the state, and is much fairer, right? We want.
You'll also see additional parties in that system,
and you're likely to get that. It makes third parties,
more likely. I mean, just so we're clear, California gave more votes to Donald Trump than any state except maybe Texas in the whole country. And Texas gave more votes to Kamala Harris than almost every other state, except California in the country. But you don't know that if you just look at the map.
If you're a Republican in California or a Democrat in Texas, you basically have no representation.
Nationally.
Nationally.
Locally, you still do. Right. Yeah. So it's and certainly after both states have re-gerrymandered, that's even more true.
Right. And let me make an important point here. The proportional representation is a thing Congress could do tomorrow. Right.
It does not require a constitutional amendment.
That's right. You don't have to amend the Constitution. The requirement for single member district comes from a 1967 statute. So the obstacle here is purely political will. It's not law.
Yeah. Although I'm worried, Ben, that if Congress made that change, our friends in the Supreme Court would say, oh, you're not allowed to do that. I am actually worried this court views itself as a grand legislator and has taken, I mean, I can't, the Anderson decision, which was Colorado 14th Amendment decision.
Right.
Huge problem. I mean, clearly the guys who wrote the Constitution didn't think it through clearly enough. It was a real problem. But it isn't up to the Supreme Court to say they didn't think it through. We're going to just change it, which they did.
I mean, this goes back to our discussion about sort of the Supreme Court acting lawlessly, at least in some cases.
Yeah.
I don't know what they would do with proportional representation. And, my reaction to that is a little bit one problem at a time. Like,
we'll see it when we see it.
We need to get the political will for this to happen. I think post-LA, I've heard some of the, traditional civil rights groups and civil rights leaders talking about proportional representation as sort of the kind of long-term reform that we really need in this country. So I think, there is a path to build the political will and maybe to get Congress to actually do something. Then I'll worry about the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I guess that's right. And we should note for everybody, look, post-Calais, a panel of judges, including 2 that Donald Trump appointed, refused to go along with a racist map in the South. They just said, no, look, we looked at the evidence, and we looked at the evidence again in light of Calais, and they made this maps to disenfranchise Black people, period.
Right. And Calais still leaves open striking down a map that is based on intentional racial discrimination. It's a very high bar. It's hard to show, which is why I think Justice Kagan rightly said this effectively guts Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. But intentional racial discrimination is still illegal. And as you say, the 3-judge panel below that includes 2 Trump appointees said, no, in this case, there was intentional racial discrimination. We held a trial. We found there was intentional racial discrimination. So even after Calais, you can't enact these maps.
Right. So that was a very positive sign.
Yes, although the 11th Circuit now stayed that lower court injunction just today. And so we'll see what happens. But
so let me ask you this. We have the evidence, because the place where you collect evidence is the lower court, right? So they had a trial. They collected the evidence beyond, I don't know what the standard is. Is it beyond reasonable doubt? Whatever the standard is. Okay. Preponderance of the evidence is perfectly clear. This was a racial gerrymander on purpose.
That's right.
The Supreme Court had that finding in front of them, and they still said there's no evidence. We're past racism in this country. When does evidence matter and when doesn't it?
Well, the Supreme Court previously upheld the Alabama decision.
Sure, they did. They upheld it before. What was it John Kerry said? I voted for it before I voted against it.
Right. So I don't think the Supreme Court has actually yet said we reject the factual findings of the district court. When push comes to shove and this comes back to the Supreme Court, which I think it will soon, that may happen. And that's just legally wrong, right? The Supreme Court owes tremendous deference to the factual findings of lower courts. So when the lower court says we held a trial, we examined the facts, the facts, it's clear that there was intentional racial discrimination based on those facts, the Supreme Court should not overturn that factual determination. But this Supreme Court has proved quite willing, I think, to kind of ignore the facts found by lower courts and
in Anderson.
Right, go directly against them, which really isn't supposed to be the Supreme Court's role.
Yeah. All right, well, Ben, if people want to find out more about Protect Democracy and their good work, how do they do it?
Yeah, you can go to our website, protectdemocracy.org. We also have a Substack newsletter called If You Can Keep It, that I read, weekly, and I recommend everyone subscribe to that. But yeah, protectdemocracy.org is our main website.
Thank you for your time today. An interesting conversation. I enjoyed it.
My pleasure. Thanks very much.
Bye.